This is Progress Culture.
Progress Culture is a weekly happening where master drummer Paul F. Murphy and I share live improvised music and impromptu conversations with people from various fields and expertises about community, value, art, science, freedom, and progress for all. We are excited to share it all with you, so have a listen and see what's going on this week on Progress Culture. Now, let's get into the show. But first, let's hear some music.
Hi, everybody. Dominic Fragman and Paul Murphy here from Sonic Spirits, a trio of musicians that includes poet Jere Carroll. And we do a show here every week in the TechPort airplane hangar called Progress Culture. And we talk about creativity and imagination and the role that those things play in the advancement of all fields. But we also talk about lots of different stuff involving community building and I don't know, we get into a lot of different things here. And we're here today with the director of TechPort, Tommy Luganbill, and also Mr. Pierre Spray, a good friend of ours. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Both of you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, it's exciting. And what I want to do today is butt out and say, these guys here are old friends. And I think you guys met in the 90s and when Pierre was running Maple Shade Studios out of a mansion in Upper Marlboro.
Right? Yep. Yeah, man.
So I want to hear about the kind of stuff you guys chew on when you get into it. So,
Well, I mean, when I met Pierre, I had no idea who Pierre was. And I was invited over to Maple Shade to record. And I showed up at Maple Shade and recorded with, I believe, the first people that I recorded with was Glenn Spearman and maybe William Parker, and then Rafe Malik. And from that moment on, basically, my drums moved to the stage in Maple Shade. And that's where I practiced daily, as well as recorded with many, many people from many different backgrounds, but mostly jazz. And Pierre had definitely, a sound of Maple Shade. I mean, it was Pierre's sound, and it was really analog. I believe it was like 2-track, straight up recording. So Pierre had built like many different types of platforms and basses. Like the piano had, I believe they were little brass stands underneath the legs of the piano, which made the piano...
It was actually brass and wood.
Brass and wood, then. Well, you would know. You made it. I only saw it. And watched our son, Jerry, and my son, Sonny, who was about 1.5 at the time, crawling all under everything there.
And to the music.
The piano sound, though, was just, the piano sound was just sort of unheard of. I mean, it definitely changed the sound tremendously. And I think you witnessed today, you used a chord on the guitar that Pierre made, and some other piece.
a piece of brass.
A piece of brass.
A brass
and
point.
it made quite a difference in the tone.
Yeah. Lots of sustained and lots more sustained. And
Why is that? Why does it make a different noise if you're using?
I'll give you the short version.
That would be preferred, yes.
Because vibration makes far more difference. We're talking about the piano now, right? And
Or
why
the
piano
guitar.
sounded
The
so
guitar.
remarkable.
How about the guitar?
Either one.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah.
The reason is because standard electrical engineering is hopelessly inadequate for audio. And the reason it's hopelessly inadequate is because it relies almost entirely on theory, and it poo-poos listening. That is, your standard electrical engineer will say, if you have a listening panel and they say A sounds better than B, and the electrical engineer will say, well, no, B measures better, so you guys are under delusion.
Interesting.
Well, when you get 3 or 4 people listening to something and agreeing that it sounds better, and it sounds more like the master tape, or it sounds more like live music. That's not unscientific evidence. I mean, that's the end point of audio engineering, is to make stuff that sounds good, not stuff that measures good.
Yeah.
I think
And when the listener contradicts the measurement, you better go back and change your measurement and change your theory, not tell him that he's living under a delusion or that he's subjective and he's influenced by the fact that the speakers look nice or something.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
That's the problem. And so right from the start, from not too long before I met Murph, I had set up the studio on the principle that only careful listening counts. I mean, and by the way, I have a mathematical and engineering background, so it's not like I have any hatred for those things. In fact, I like them a lot. But I also like science, and science says when the evidence says your predictions are wrong, then you go back and redo everything, your theory, your practice, everything. And that's what I did at the studio. And very quickly, I learned that wires make a difference. Most engineers will tell you, well, if the wire has a low enough resistance and low enough capacitance, it's fat enough, one wire sounds like the other and they all measure the same. Well, that's hogwash.
I think
Your guys here will say that, they plug in the wire and the guitar sounds different. Well, it sounds different because, in fact, just to give you a few elements of what's involved, is almost every guitar cable, just like every speaker cable, is too fat. And that involves actually a very subtle physical principle that microwave engineers know about, but audio engineers don't, which is called skin effect. I won't go into it. But you want the wire as thin as you can get away with. And that actually makes the bass better and the treble better, and gives you clearer detail, which is exactly what you heard. That's one piece. The alloy counts. You have to have very pure copper. And the plastic, the insulation counts. The insulation is of enormous importance. In fact, if you take any standard guitar cord that you bought for $3 and you just strip the plastic off it, it immediately sounds better because the plastic is absorbing energy. There is no such thing in this world as a perfect insulator. And insulators vary a lot. So when I first started designing wires with a partner of mine who's a far more sophisticated electrical engineer, really sophisticated, the simple-minded thing we did to look at this question of insulation, it's really easy. I mean, being scientific doesn't necessarily involve a lot of fancy equipment. We simply took wires that we were transmitting music over, and we laid them on different pieces of plastic and different pieces of cloth and so on. It was astonishing. You could immediately hear the signature of the insulation. Music sounded different when you put it on PVC or when you put it on wool. And it turned out, by the way, by and large, the organic fibers all sounded far better than the plastic fibers. There are a few plastics that sound very good, very few. And that's what we use on our wires, like on the cable I gave you for your guitar, because you need the insulation. I mean, you can't have it bare, because it'll be a problem, a shorting problem. But once you've gotten to the right plastic or organic fiber, then thicker is worser, right? No matter how good it is, the very best insulation you have, if it's twice as thick, it's still bad because it's going to absorb more energy from the signal and do worse. It smears the signal. What you hear when you have bad plastic on a wire is it sounds kind of like you put a horse blanket over the speaker. It sounds dulled and it sounds smeared.
Yeah, but let's touch on something. I don't know, Dominic, if you were about to say this. I want to touch on the fact that you said that the listeners can all be saying one thing, and then the engineers will say, well, it doesn't measure properly. So that's clearly a mindset problem. That's not just limited to speakers, right?
Yeah, what I was going to say is
I ran into that problem in defense engineering,
Right.
designing of airplanes.
Yeah.
It's universal.
I was going to say that
You're absolutely onto it.
Right, and I think, Dominic, you were about to say that,
Yeah,
too.
I was going to say that we have seemed to encounter that problem very often, like whether or not it's, I mean, you said that they go by theory as opposed to experience, it seems.
Well, I mean, theory is very helpful.
Sure, but I mean,
it's
like,
very
look,
important not to believe it.
Yeah, well, this is something that I find often is that in the music world, people will sort of stake everything by what the theory says. And they're trying to develop things or have listening practices or distinguish between high quality and not high quality by whether or not it fits a theory. But what are you listening? When you listen, I mean, it's sound. The sound will tell you what you need to know more than the theory will. But I think to sort of take it beyond that is that this is a practice, this measurability, the phenomenon of measurement and whether or not it fits with these metrics that we determine something is quality or has value by. We experience that all the time here, and I see in different disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, it's just funny to me because you said just because it's a theory doesn't mean you have to pay attention to it. I was listening to something about, there was a lady measuring the speed that stars rotate around the center of a galaxy. And in theory, the stars that are closest to the center should go faster than the stars that are on the outside, in theory. But she started measuring them, and turns out they don't. They all go the same speed. And so when she showed people this, the astronomer community was like, that's not possible. And so she says, okay, I'll get more data. So she does more and more and more and more. And they made her do this for like 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Before they finally said, oh, maybe they do all rotate at the same speed. Our theory was wrong.
You might have a point.
Right. And she's like, so I think there's this thing called dark matter. And that was kind of this idea. But now people are saying, well, is that actually what's causing it? Maybe there's dark matter, maybe there isn't. But it goes to this point that you made, which is that I think people live and die by these theories.
You have to be open to evidence.
But that's what scientists always say. Oh, we will let the science lead our way, but then they're the first ones to get stuck. How do you combat that? I mean, what?
Well, a lot of it's the fault of our schools. Our schools don't teach skepticism.
Yeah.
You know, I'll give you what for me was an enormously profound insight from one of my Greek friends that I used to hang out with. We were talking about skepticism, and very often people use it like to attack you. Oh, you're a skeptic, right?
Yeah.
And he says, you have to understand, in classical, ancient Greek, the word for thought, think about this, the word for thought is skepsis. In other words, the ancient Greeks couldn't conceive of thinking unskeptically, right? Every aspect of thought has to be, in a sense, skeptical.
Yeah.
And so theory is extremely valuable, and it can lead you to new experiments, it can lead you to predictions, and when the predictions turn out to be wrong, then the theory has to be modified, and you make more progress. But you have to view theory, no matter how strong somebody says the evidence is, you have to do it the way the ancient Greeks did, skeptically. You know, that's interesting. I like your evidence. Let me dig into that. And now, what about over here, right? And that's what science is about. That's what thought is about.
Right.
You know, true believer thought is not thought. You know, it's something else. It's religion, not to poo-poo religion, but it's different than technical or artistic thought. It's not the same thing. And you're right, people have true religions in music.
Yeah, for sure.
I had them. That was one of the great things about starting the studio and meeting guys like Murphy. I had these very narrow views about if it wasn't jazz or blues or Baroque classical music, I wasn't going to listen. I got that beaten out of me real quick by good musicians. That was a really dumb attitude.
Oh, yeah, man, because
The
you
same
had
thing.
like all different music there. I mean, I played with a lot of it, like the Clifford Jordans and Walter Davises, and also the country western,
Nice.
also Baroque. also straight up classical, and also African. And you had the ability to mic all of it exactly how you were feeling it was best. And it was different than how other people, let's just say, were doing things.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, it wasn't a matter of taste. In fact, I was trying very hard not to impose my own tastes on the sound. It was a question of comparing as carefully as I could, and listeners with me. I always try to have other people listen too, to make sure that, you know, for instance, that I may have too much taste for bass. I like bass too much, right? Not
Right.
everybody does, right?
Yeah.
So you try to get listeners that you respect, that listen to a lot of live music, and to make the studio setup better, what you do is compare the recording, the tape, and what just went down in the live music. But the live music is the standard. That's what you're trying to get to. A lot of engineers think they're going to improve on the live music by using filters and EQ and so on.
Right.
I find that anathema. You know, I'm
Right.
trying to do what went down in the studio or in the nightclub or on the concert stage. You know, exactly the way the musicians wanted it, not the way I want it. So,
Right.
and there's a whole, in a way, there's a whole science of listening. You know, listening isn't just, you know, I like it, I don't like it. It's a discipline. And you have to be very careful about how you do it and the circumstances and the fact that you don't prejudice listeners and so on. You know, like tell them in advance, I really like this better, now listen. You have to be extremely careful because
Well, and you
things-
just did that recently with the drums. I mean, you made the studs out of brass, and replacing what's there with brass stud definitely not only it definitely changed the sound,
right.
The studs.
but it also, the things that you turn to tune,
That changes the noise of the drum.
it not only changed it changed it a great deal, and it changed it a great deal to the positive.
Just by changing the type of metal?
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a whole different kind of thing that I'm deep into now. Back when Murphy and I first met, I was very much into simply getting the electronics and the acoustics of the studio right to reproduce live music as closely as possible. I spent lots of years doing that, and getting into the question of wires and vibration and acoustic reflection and so on. And in every area, I found indeed that 98% of the theory and 98% of the common belief among engineers was simply hogwash. It was not confirmed by the evidence of people listening and what they liked better or worse. But now, the thing I'm really interested in, besides all that research I did back then, is working directly on instruments, because I've always had this passion for getting instruments to sound better, starting with that piano.
Right.
That piano was an old 1911 Steinway
Right.
that some
Pierre, you said
some way past girlfriend left me,
Pierre, you
and
said
that I got very involved with improving. But
Metaphor.
now, and that was 1990 or so.
Yeah.
Now I'm back to that, of taking instruments, guitars, drums, pianos,
And cello and
almost
bass,
anything,
right?
contrabasses,
Yeah.
and working directly on them, not in an electronic way, not with wires and stuff like that,
Cool.
but working directly to see how you can create a more beautiful resonance. And there's a lot of stuff that works, like the perception that brass is normally a better material for transmitting vibration than steel. So, Murph and I have a whole series of experiments going on how to make drums sound better. But this one was great because it was so easy. We had a beautiful snare drum of his that, much to my surprise and joy, had all brass hardware,
Right.
which was good. I said, wow, the guys who built this knew what they were doing. They'd been listening too, right?
Right.
Except the little screws that tension the head, both the head on the bottom and the head on the top. We found that out because I borrowed a kitchen magnet
Right. Right.
from Murph, and we found out, there's a piece of steel here, and it's in a very crucial place, because when the head vibrates, right, that's what creates the sound of the drum. Right? If the stick hits the head, it vibrates, that creates, and then those vibrations flow through the head, into the rim, and very critically through those tightening screws into the wooden body of the drum. And so I said, wow, there's a chance to do something. We got some screws to fit.
Yep.
I mean, we Mickey Moused it too. They weren't that great looking. And we replaced,
They're still in it.
we just replaced the top screws, just on top head. And just that alone was a transformation. When we did that
Right.
bottom head, it would like double the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of simple listening experiment. That's real science. I mean, people say, oh, no, that's just, you're just hobby shopping. No, that's real science. Just because we didn't use an oscilloscope to find out that the brass improved the sound of the drum.
Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, Pierre, you said something about that what you found after doing your own research, in particular to acoustic stuff and electric wires and all that, is what the science, or the engineers rather, were believing and practicing was hogwash. Have you found that in other aspects of disciplines that you've worked on, or
Have I ever?
yeah? What else? Where else are you seeing that, or how else has that played out in other
I
things?
mean, the first half of my adult life I spent on defense problems, on analyzing defense, testing in defense, and designing fighter airplanes. And you get exactly the same thing. You get people who get mesmerized by certain measures, as you were saying, certain metrics, like speed,
Yeah.
And that became like a religion with the Air Force, probably from, I would guess from 1915 on, the number one thing they tried to do in new airplanes was make them go higher and faster.
Yeah.
Right?
It's America,
Because you
man.
could
Let's go.
Right? And it wasn't that it was totally irrational,
Yeah.
right? But they didn't stop and think about what were the effects in combat. They just said, oh man, it's got to go higher, it's got to go faster. And we got into a generation, I mean, for a while, that more or less worked. Like in World War I, the airplanes that were faster and flew higher tended to win dogfights.
Yeah.
But not just because of that, but also because flying higher implies larger wing area, which means more maneuverability. There are more subtleties to this than that. But the Air Force never got the subtleties. In fact, in some ways, they haven't even got it yet, in some ways. And I'm not talking about the Air Force in general, but I'm talking about common belief and what drives procurement. And so, you have this whole mythology now that if an airplane can't go Mach 2 or 2.5, it can't win in combat. You know, it turns out that the more you work on making it go Mach 2, the more you reduce the drag and improve the aerodynamics at high supersonic speed, the worse you're going to do in combat, because combat doesn't take place at Mach 2 for a very simple reason. You know, it's all these things that come back to the real world and the real experience of real pilots in real dogfights. Is if you try to go Mach 2, you run out of fuel.
Yeah.
You hit Mach 2 and you got to go home. You know, so obviously, there's not going to be very much combat at Mach 2.
Right.
And in fact, if you take, for instance, the evidence, the last war for which we have really good evidence of air combat, because there was a lot of it, was Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, we've had, you know, very shaky air-to-air combat. I mean, we've had lots of bombing, but not much air-to-air combat. And in that war, every fight started at somewhere between Mach 0.7 and Mach 0.9. Why? Because that's where you had to cruise to get to the target, right? If you cruised at 1.2, you weren't going to get to the target, right? That's how the airplanes were back then. Was there a value to speed? Yeah. If you could cruise 100 knots faster than the other guy, that was very important, because that meant he was very unlikely to come up behind you by surprise, and you were quite likely to come up behind him by surprise. So, you know, a modest cruise speed advantage is terrific. Going Mach 2 cripples you because it actually reduces your ability to fly at Mach 0.9 or Mach 1 or Mach 1.2.
But for like surveillance and things like that, I assume speed and height, that makes a lot of sense, right? The higher you go, the faster you go, take pictures, things like that. But if you're in combat, it doesn't seem to matter.
There's no combat at 50,000 feet.
Right.
Air's too thin. You
Right,
can't
exactly.
turn. And if you can't turn, you die.
Yeah.
Because missiles can home on you when you don't turn.
Yeah.
You have to turn to defeat missiles and to defeat aimed gunfire, of course.
Yeah.
So, you know, what's the evidence? The evidence in all this is combat. You sit down and you go in detail through dogfight after dogfight after dogfight. And you listen to what people have to say, or you transcribe it, and you go over what were the circumstances, what made this guy win, what made this guy break off, you know. And then you can sit down and talk about the real effect of height, speed, maneuverability, acceleration.
Do the pilots get to speak to the people designing the jet?
Sorry?
Do the actual combat pilots have the chance to speak to the people designing these jet fighters?
Less and less. The more money that goes into defense, the less the combat pilots are allowed to speak.
So
Because
Why's
it
that?
interferes with the flow of money.
yeah.
Why does it interfere with the flow of money?
Because they're telling them
Because
things
if
they
they
don't
tell
want to
the
hear.
truth,
They
you
don't
know,
want to hear the truth.
really good pilots, the best pilots that I've known, I mean, guys were like world class, all had the attitude, they give us crap to fly and we win anyhow. That's a good attitude.
That's my attitude here. Edit.
We never edit.
And there's a deep truth under that, which is the skill of the pilot is of overwhelmingly more importance than whether you cruise at Mach 0.7 or Mach 0.72.
But that flies in the face of what you said in the beginning, which is you can't measure that.
Sure, you measure it. You measure it by listening to the evidence.
Well,
Not all
why
evidence
don't,
comes
so then
in
why
numbers.
so then why don't scientists take that more seriously? If you look at, you just said what I believe, by the way, I believe what you just said. If the pilot is good, give them crap and they'll win.
Yeah.
But then the fundamental scientists are going to say, oh, well, no, it's got to be the jet fighter that did it. So what is the division there where people aren't taking it more seriously to measure the skill of the pilot?
The problem is that you have this tremendous division between unskeptical engineers, you know, who simply, they don't want to hear about combat, right? They want to hear about drag and lift.
That's crazy.
And, and thrust and specific fuel consumption and all that. That's what they're trained to listen to. And they don't understand that evidence comes in many forms. And the most crucial evidence, if you're designing an airplane to fly air-to-air combat,
Yeah.
which is different than designing an airplane to bomb or designing an airplane to carry passengers.
Yep.
But in each case, the ultimate evidence is the mission and how it's accomplished. Same with airliners. What counts is how happy are the passengers with how they got from A to B.
True.
Not whether it took more gas or less gas, you know.
Yeah.
And a designer who really has an open mind takes that into account when he's designing an airplane. Where you put the doors on a passenger airplane makes a big difference,
Yeah.
right? Well, people, you know, because of marketing pressures, that kind of knowledge kind of filters down to engineers, but they should be trained in advance to say, look, you're designing stuff, whether it's a drone to take great video pictures or a fighter airplane to shoot down other airplanes. You're designing stuff for a purpose, and you better get deep into that purpose, with or without numbers, whatever it takes. You need to understand the purpose and understand how people execute it. And the same thing is true in medicine. Just, you know, take the case of masks. You know, the masks,
Right.
the science around masks is so murky, it's stupid, right? And there's a huge difference between what a mask does in a laboratory, you know, which is well worth doing. I'm not against, you know, the whole low-speed aerodynamics of masks are very interesting to me. I have like a little side passion for low-speed aerodynamics.
Okay. All right.
And when you test a mask in the laboratory and you create particles to blow through it and you look at how efficiently it filters out,
Right.
you get some very interesting results. You know, and they're useful if you then look at the user, right? And there's like several levels of user. You got to really keep this in mind. There's medical users, like surgeons and nurses, right? Who are trained, who know how to fit the mask, who know enough not to fiddle with them and touch them with dirty hands and
Right.
stuff like that. And then there's the general public. And if you're building a mask or designing a mask for a hospital, that's one thing. You need to know exactly how nurses and doctors use them or misuse them, right? And you design for that. But if you're designing masks for everybody around here, you're talking about people who have no idea how to handle a mask and who handle it in a very unsterile way. You know, they don't wash their hands before they put it on, you know, all this. And so you have to collect the evidence.
Right.
You know, you take a mask and you put it on people like that,
Right.
and and the evidence in that case is, does it stop respiratory diseases or not? And there's quite a bit of evidence of that from like flu and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the evidence says we're living in a world of delusion about masks.
I want to go to this idea of purpose. I like the way that you put that about, like, if you're going to design something or engage in an endeavor to really get deep into the purpose. And I think that that's something that has really helped me to develop the kind of ideas in music that we're developing, and to now whatever it is that we're developing. It's not even so much that; it's that part where what the purpose of music is. Not so much how I want to make a living off of it, or what I think should be played so I can sell more records or play in front of more people, as I dig more into the purpose of music, which is supposed to be one of the 7 sacred liberal arts that is able to illuminate the truths of the universe. As you go back to the ancient Greeks, like you talked about, there was the trivium and the quadrivium, the 7 sacred liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and then mathematics, geometry. What is it? Geometry. Help me out here. Geometry. It's geometry
Or numbers.
or math. Yeah, numbers, and then it's music, and then it's astronomy.
And poetry.
Well, as far as the 7, the quadrivium and the trivium, I can't remember what that 4th one is, but they're basically numbers in time, numbers in space, and numbers in space and time. And those things were believed to be tools that were able to help us illuminate some of those infinite truths of the universe through creative expression from the person, which was able to sort of manifest possibilities. But if I'm only playing just like by following that theory that, hey, guess what? Drums are supposed to keep time, so all I'm going to do is do this.
And nothing is more boring than metronomic time.
Right, I agree. But that's how most music is made these days, and especially with the introduction of click tracks into every single recording you can think of. This is what you get in your headphones, and you better play and stay on time with that.
Wait, so when musicians are recording, they have that in their ear?
Most of them these
When
days,
they're recording,
and live too. Live, I was just talking to Brian Jordan about
That's
this
like
yesterday.
a quarterback wearing like the coach in their ear. That's terrible.
And it goes beyond that too, because when you're playing live now, all the light shows, all the video shows, all the backing tracks of the instruments that were used in the studio that they can't afford to tour with are all on some track that they hit play on and stay in time with the click track, and that's how the show goes on.
And boy, does it sound synthetic
Yeah.
when the product
Right.
comes out.
But if I go to the purpose.
That's exactly what I was trying to fight in my studio. I wanted music to sound as exciting as it did when you were sitting in the studio or sitting at the front row of the nightclub.
And you did
And
that
that's a
too
totally
with the
different
poet.
experience than manufactured recorded music that comes out of, synthesizer studios.
Yeah.
I mean, some of it's interesting. It's not that it isn't interesting, but it doesn't have that excitement.
Yeah.
And it also lacks something else, which is
Creative
the back
expression.
and forth communication, the back and forth energy between audience and musicians.
Musicians.
And that's
Not only
where
audience.
people get the purpose of music all wrong. If you don't understand that music is an interaction between people and musicians, and if you don't focus on that, and it means you have to look at the people. Not everybody listens to music the same way.
Right.
And I mean, traditionally, music had a lot more purpose than to just entertain people.
Right.
Music was used in healing ceremonies, it was used in religious ceremonies, and each of those purposes and each of those audiences is different. And you got to dig into that evidence. How do they feel when they hear it? If it makes them feel more faith in God, then it's beautiful religious music. And if it doesn't, if it gets them to thinking about grandma's apple pie, you better do something different.
There's a definite difference when Dominic and I play. We're interacting with each other, and we interact with the room as well, or the people in the room as well. And then there's a difference, though, also when we add the poet, Jere, to that music, because then the music, it involves and evolves into a much different sphere than what it was in as a group of two.
Yeah, the purpose has changed. The purpose has been to add meaning and emotion to poetry,
Right.
or meaning and emotion to theater.
Right, we have to
And-
adapt to that, and accommodate.
And there's exactly going back, digging into the purpose, as you were talking about. And if musicians don't do that, if they don't respect that, then they make synthetic music.
Right.
Well,
Exactly.
We're winding down here,
Yeah.
so I'll just say that I think that idea of the purpose is not just that the musicians will make something synthetic without having that deep understanding of purpose. I think that happens across disciplines as
And
well.
by the way, I happen to think that music cannot possibly make serious progress for what it's supposed to do for people without live audiences. I mean, if we
We're trying.
Yeah.
if
Right.
we degenerated into a world where we only made music in the studio, I shudder to think of what it would come out like after half a century or so. And that's very sad about the last year. One of the things that has affected me the most in the last year is not being able to go to hear live music.
Yeah.
It's bad for
Right,
musicians,
that's
it's
true.
bad for people, and it's bad for the progress of music.
Yeah.
The audience has a lot to do with the progress of music. Should have a lot to do, let me put
Right.
it that way. Doesn't always.
All right. Well, I agree, and I would just say I like this idea of being a skeptic and keeping the understanding of purpose in whatever it is that you're doing, whatever study you're involved in, all of it. Just I like that. Keep
It's
that
a
going.
very profound idea.
Yeah. So keep
Thanks.
that in your brain. Thank you for being here, Pierre and Tommy, and everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Here all.
Southern Maryland loves you.
Absolutely. So We will see you guys next week. Thanks for tuning in. You can find out everything you need to know on sonic-spirits.com and progressculture.org. And the videos are posted every week on those sites as well as YouTube. So check it out. Feel free to get in touch, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you all so much for being with us. We appreciate you sharing your time and consideration. Please feel free to reach out to Sonic Spirits and Progress Culture at sonic-spirits.com and progressculture.org. You can also connect with us through our sponsors at techportsomd.org and somdlovesyou.org. We'd love to hear from you if you're working on something awesome, or you have ideas for future shows, or you just like to say hello. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Much love, and see you soon.